What made the creepiest person you ever met so creepy? Story 1. I used to hitchhike back in the day. I was in South Texas, and some older guy picked me up and started talking about sex, and then told me about how he liked to go to New Orleans and get a couple of little boys, and then went into some great detail. It was the only time I ever told someone to just pull over and let me out. I'd even slipped my knife out and had it concealed in my right hand, just in case. He just pulled over and let me out. It took me a few minutes before I could walk back out to the highway to try for another ride. This was probably 1979. It was 1980, and I was 16. He was driving a yellow four-door Cadillac, probably late 70s model, in case you were thinking about that weird uncle. Story 2. Was kayaking a river when some dude decided to dive off a cliff head first into a rock below the water's surface and had a huge gash in his head. A guy came running out of the woods, full Rambo attire, headband and all, poured moonshine over the cut and bandaged the guy up, then ran back into the woods. Pretty creepy, but probably saved that guy's life. Story 3. 25F. Was working out at a fairly busy gym with one other person in the gym at the time, as it was late at night. He made a point to only work out on the equipment directly behind me, and every time I would move to another, he would move to the machine behind. It happened so many times that I started to text my boyfriend to tell him I was getting kind of creeped out by a guy at the gym, and I was uncomfortable because I was alone in the building with him. There's an entire wall in this gym that's just a long mirror, so you can see the entire room through this giant thing. I look up at the mirror as I'm texting my boyfriend, and this man was standing behind me and reading my text over my shoulder from behind the machine. Instead of freaking out and making the situation more dangerous for myself, I stood up and got off the machine and put my phone in my pocket and briskly walked to the front door without even turning around. I walked out and got in my car safely, but by this point I was full of adrenaline and fear. Luckily, he didn't follow. I don't know why he would have done that or what his intentions were, but I noped the fuck out of there. Reported it to my gym the next day and was told they would investigate and handle it. Never saw him again, thank God. Story 4. Random guy walks into the restaurant I was working at before. He asked for crazy coworker, we didn't interact at all, if she was working or if I can give her schedule. I declined both because it was information he didn't need to know. Told another coworker at the time, and she told me the same guy would sit at a corner table and watch her work. At that point, I told her that he was banned and to let crazy coworker tell him he was banned and can't come back. I also informed the cooks and to have the cooks make sure she left safely. This only happened because he happened to give me a creepy chill down my spine when he walked in and asked the question. Story 5. He kept looking at my feet and ankle and asked to rub my feet the first time I decided to hang out with him. Luckily, when he approached me, while he was cute, I was cautious and made our first hangout a group hangout, which now I am so glad about. He got creepier the second hangout. Public again. And then when I decided a couple of hangouts were enough and I ended our contact, I later saw him in the news arrested for trying to break into a girl's house and trying to rape her. Story 6. My ex would ask me to tell him stories about traumatizing events in my life. I shared things like getting attacked by a rabid dog. That whole story is actually hilarious and makes me laugh to this day. I was an adult and the dog was very small and I was traveling abroad alone in a rural area. I told him this story unprompted the first time, but he would ask me to tell it over again regularly. He asked me to retell him multiple times about when I was robbed at gunpoint alone as a teenager, etc. When I would retell him these stories, he would close his eyes and smile and start breathing slowly and heavily in and out through his nose, like he was breathing in the story and fantasizing about it or something. He would say things with his eyes closed like, and then you were just alone on the ground, surrounded, right? You were completely helpless. And tease the details he wanted to hear out of me like this. I don't know, man, maybe it's not too intense, but it felt like he was getting off to it in his head. The tone of voice he would use with his questioning was so sexual. The tone you would use during sex or foreplay. I gaslight myself to this day that I just imagine or read too much into it, but he's the scariest person I've ever met. And the creepiest, too. Story 7. Over 20 years ago, I worked for a homeopathic shop in a tourist town. One day, the owner and I were chatting at the cash register. It was a slow day and we were discussing floor displays for the upcoming season. A small woman, maybe in her mid-50s, was browsing in the shop. Her movements were just off. She wasn't pacing or shaky, but she definitely had an elevated energy. Like she was agitated or annoyed. The owner and I greeted her. She came straight towards us like she was pissed. She directed her anger at the owner, asking odd things like why there was no gift wrap service offered. Then she wanted to know why the jewelry was out and not in locked display cases. She was all over the map. No rhyme or reason to her questions. I thought she was eccentric or off her meds or something. The owner was tense and starting to be very nervous. I stepped into their conversation to redirect the woman and let the owner regroup. The woman, who had been to this moment acting like I wasn't even there, turned her gaze to me. My brothers and sisters in Christ, I swear to you, the woman's eyes changed color. She looked at me and they were black, not like dilated, but entirely black. I saw no iris color. To this day, I have no idea what that was about, but I will never forget it. Story 8. Creepiest person I've ever met was a woman I knew when I was a teenager. I was 14 or 15, a freshman in high school, and heavily into the hardcore scene. It was that awkward age where you're drinking hard liquor for the first time in the woods behind the barn with the boys every weekend. And you look like a man, so you think you are one. But you're still totally a kid. I met a strange woman at a hardcore show. She was around 24 or 25, and she almost instantly developed a massive crush on me. I have no idea why. We had literally nothing in common other than liking hardcore shows. She wanted to be introduced to my parents. She talked to me every night on AIM for like 6 hours. She'd find out which shows I was going to and then show up there and spend the whole time trying to hug me or hang on my arm, or wait for me outside the bathroom. I'd never received any kind of female attention, so I wasn't sure how to feel about it. She was more attractive than anyone we went to school with. So my friends thought I was a stud, and my parents thought it was a cute, silly thing that I had an older friend. I told a guidance counselor at school about it, and he gave me a high five, but the whole thing made me feel kind of nauseous, just like a gut feeling of, there's something not right happening here. Anytime I had a crush on a girl, or a dude for that matter, she'd bother my friends, until they'd tell her who it was, then throw a tantrum and yell about how other girls were whores, and she was the one listening to me and all my problems, and when was I going to wake up and see that true love was right in front of me the whole time? And when that didn't work because it never worked, I thought she was scary and unstable. She'd cry and say nobody loved her until me or another of my friends would comfort her. This went on for years. She never tried anything physical with me outside of the hugging. What she wanted was a guy who was wholly devoted to her in an Edward Cullen kind of way, but who never wanted anything sexual or physical. She believed all sex was disgusting or something that evil men do to women against their will. And from my adult understanding of the situation, what she liked about me was that I was old enough to have all-encompassing crushes/limerence on people, but too young to have a sex drive. Eventually, when I was around 18 or 19, she lost interest, and from what I heard, she started dating a guy around my age with Down syndrome. I ran into her when I was in my early 20s because we were hanging out with some older friends and she showed up and she called me a dark-hearted psychopath because I had the audacity to grow up. Haven't seen her or heard from her since. Good riddance. Story 9. He had no friends, so to be nice one day, I invited him over after school to trade some cards. The second my dog met him, Doggo's body language shifted to tense and alert. Dog wouldn't let us be in the same room without sitting between us and straight stared him down the entire time, and it was the weirdest vibe. Never did that to anyone else. Creepiest dude I ever met, to be honest. While he was over, he openly told me he stole a girl's wallet so he could find it and ask her out. I didn't hang out with him anymore after that. Story 10. Dude called other people NPCs and couldn't understand that women have their own thoughts that don't involve trying to impress men. Like, he couldn't understand that women have hobbies because they're fun, weird, narcissistic, and creepy. Oh yeah, he doesn't like it when he gets called creepy. Story 11. I was 26-ish working with an older guy, like mid or late 40s, and my beautiful female friend from college got hired as well. Now I may be biased, but I thought she was an absolute knockout. Smart, funny, creative, assertive, and just achingly beautiful. I had asked her out in college and got turned down. That's okay. It evolved into a wonderful friendship. Anyway, I'm giving you the backstory because that older guy I worked with, he was at least 20 plus years older, had a crazy crush on her, compared her to his daughter who was the same age, asked me all about her, and wanted me to give him insights on wooing her. He eventually started making sexually suggestive comments to her, mentioning things like how he had a mirror on his ceiling so he could see himself making love, etc. My friend was rightfully repulsed by him, but not the kind of person to complain to HR or our boss. We constantly ridiculed him when he wasn't around, slagging off on his inappropriate jokes or attempts to hit on her. Our boss knew he was being weird to my friend, and when we had to downsize the department, he was the only one cut, much to everyone's relief. Story 12. I've never been more scared of anyone than this literal rando that came into my work to ask about a job opening there. I was the only person there, and the longer this dude stayed, the more I regretted that I was. To this day, I couldn't say what exactly set off the alarm bells in my mind, but everything in me screamed to get away. He didn't do anything wrong, just asked questions, but then got visibly distressed that I needed to take a copy of his license for a basic background check. If I had to take a stab at anything, it was probably the tone of his voice, completely devoid of feeling and emotion. He then said, "No, it's fine, never mind," and literally walked out the door without continuing the application. I was so relieved when he did. Story 13. He stalked me, threatened me, got me involved in a cross-county legal thing, caused me to beg for a restraining order, which was finally granted, lied about me, harassed me, and showed up to my house with a gun. Why? I was his co-worker at a retail store for a few months and said no when he wanted sex randomly. I barely knew his name at the time. He's an influencer now that he's out of jail. Story 14. My great uncle. I met him when I was about 10 years old, and I didn't even need to hear my parents' warnings to not like him. He was in his 50s back then, balding, but grew out long, thin, wispy hair that he greased back, and he wore skinny jeans. He was a thin guy with a hunched back and sunken eyes from years of drugs and alcohol. His voice was nasally, too. He radiated creepy vibes, stared at me and my younger sister too much, talked like he wanted us to like him, but we weren't buying that. The only reason we met him was because my great-grandmother, his mother, was being moved to a retirement home and we were helping clear out her house, which he still lived in. Turned out he had stolen over $10,000 from her by faking her signature on checks, and she didn't know any better because she got dementia. No press charges. They just told him to get lost, and he vanished afterwards for several years. It was a bit of a blowout between my granddad and him. They are half-brothers. While we cleaned out the house, which he had junked up, my mom found a camcorder with pictures of him cross-dressing in skimpy women's clothes. Once I was older, my grandmother also told me how he was a bad man. No one will cry for that man when he finally dies. Story 15. In senior year, I had class with this one guy. He started talking to me because I sat behind him and we had a break period together. He seemed like a decent guy despite my initial impressions. And then one day, randomly, he started mentioning how much better he thought Asian girls were in comparison to white girls. He talked about how much more submissive and pure they were, and how all white girls were whores. It became all he ever talked about. Shit creeped me the fuck out, and I stopped talking to him after that. Story 16. I worked with this weird guy who claimed he had Asperger's. He was a known convicted kitty diddler and all-around weirdo. He'd tell you the same joke repeatedly throughout the day, have weird outbursts of swearing over tiny things, poor hygiene, a mega loud voice, et al. Any one of those things would be enough. But what really freaked me out about him was when he told a few of us this funny story about the emails and texts he'd send online scammers. You know, those hot babes in your area types, and carry on weird conversations with them as a joke. One example was when he told one his sexual fantasy was for his pet rats to gnaw their way through her vagina and come out her stomach. And another was him telling a different one that his last girlfriend went missing. They can't find her or her car at all. Not only did he tell it like it was a real knee slapper story, but it also sounded like a humble brag. I told HR and nothing happened, yet I got in trouble for using emojis in a company chat. That's one of many reasons why I quit. I have no doubt that that dude has murdered at least one person. Story 17. 18-year-old on bath salts. He was a privileged kid who'd gotten high. I worked in a medical facility where the ER transferred inebriated but stable patients. People were sometimes confrontational or combative. Every so often, a few bad apples on the staff would push someone too far and get punched by a patient. But not me. Never had a problem except this one kid. He was a normie, high out of his mind during the bath salt craze. He was brought in, looked right army, no one else, and would not stop. Watched me with this creepy, too big smile. I went into the back rooms behind a wall, and on camera, I could see him staring in my direction. Same creepy smile the whole time. He eventually snuck out of the back room when no one was looking and snuck up behind me. Totally silent, same creepy smile, and grabbed my wrists. Not a sound. Oh, and up there. I yelled, coworkers tackled and restrained him, and we packed him off to the psych ward. Creepiest dude ever. Don't do drugs made in a bathtub, kids. Edit forgot to say. Only sound he made was sometimes a low, creepy, breathy laugh to himself. While staring at me, smiling, no one could get his attention. Story 18. This one old woman who subbed my class in 6th grade, she looked like she just crawled out of a nursing home morgue. Never got up from her seat at the desk. She literally just told everyone to sit down. Did the attendance. Then just said, "It's free study time, so do what you want." Then just stared at the wall with her mouth slightly open. She looked like she had dead eyes, and if it wasn't for her coughing a few times, we legitimately thought she was dead. I passed by that class on my way out of school, and despite the classroom completely empty, she remained in the same position. We never saw her again.